Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief, a strategic guide on how to not be an asshole at work. We'll tell you about bad bosses, how they can be handled, how to tell if you happen to be one. An executive and an executive coach, both artists working in advertising and marketing for more than 2 decades, are here to advise you on the ins and outs of office environments. The Bad Boss Brief is your ultimate guide to navigating any employment landscape. Here are your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo.
Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
That was enthusiasm.
Yay!
And I'm Eugene S. Robinson.
Nice to speak to everyone. This is episode 14. And today we're going to talk about the new boss. Now, this was an idea that was submitted by a listener. Thank you, listener. You know who you are. And anyone who wants to submit an idea for a show, WTF at Bad Boss Brief. But what our listener was talking about was that one of the challenges he saw in his career, and he works at one of the aptly acronymed FANG companies, and that he's seen happen is that if you are a really strong IC, which is what they call individual contributors, and you do well, suddenly you get bumped up into management and you are the boss of other people. And you have no understanding that it might take a different skill set or a different muscle to manage people than it did for you to do your individual contributor shtick. What do you think?
100%. 100%. In fact, I was an individual contributor at Intel when I was at Intel. But they didn't move me into a managerial position, but they did so at Apple and started out the same way. So it was always interesting to be one and stay one, but then to be one and be forced to be the other. In actual fact, my very first job out of college was that way too. And I did not want to make the move. And one, because it was from one magazine to another. It was from a non-defense magazine to a defense industry magazine. I don't want to have anything to do with defense. And they explained to me very clearly in kind of mafiosi terms that they weren't asking me if I wanted the transfer. They were telling me they were transferring me. And that was the only option. Were I to opt out, there's the door. So it's very interesting that, even though it was a move up, they still found a way to reify this idea that you work for us, you do what we say. And so it was good bossing, bad bossing, all at once, but they were very distinctly different experiences. So you're right.
Well, and what was it like for you, that first kind of management experience out of school?
It was difficult. And I sort of felt set up for it. Now we're not talking about the defense magazine, but I guess this has happened a lot. The Electric Power Research Institute, where I swear to goodness that the sole reason they brought me in was to fire a 55-year-old guy on the staff they couldn't figure out how to get rid of any other way. And they were like, hey, new guy right out of college. Now that you are managerial, you got to get rid of a Lloyd. And I was like, not cool with this. And of course, it made it as difficult as possible. The guy started crying. I've got a family. I've got kids. I'm old enough. I won't get another job, all of which I knew to be true, But, I thought it was a test for me to see if, can you do the hard things at this job? In actuality, I realized I was Tom Sawyered. Yeah, no, they were not brave enough to get rid of this guy and just made me do it. So.
Yeah, I mean, they threw you in the deep end.
Yeah. And so my take on, so that means that by the time I got to Intel and they tried to move me, or not, Intel didn't, Apple did. I resisted the move at first because I'm like, I'm fine here. I'm okay. I'm okay. And they,
in both cases, I mean, what the listener went on to comment, the fact that there's no support given by these large companies for, let us teach you how to manage. Let us teach you how to be a boss. The assumption is that it's something you're sipping in the water that will make it so you can instantly fall into that. And what he suggested is that there are a couple of pitfalls. One is there's this hubris. right?
Yeah.
That these new leaders will believe that they can do it just because they're smart guys, or they're successful so far, and a lot of times they don't have humility.
Yeah.
Right? They don't understand, like, maybe I should check it out. Maybe I should see how the dynamics are different working as an IC than working in sort of a larger group. And it sounds like that organization didn't support you at all by putting you into that difficult position.
No, and it was probably I can comfortably talk about it now, but it's probably one of the weirdest jobs I've had, the Electric Power Research Institute, because they were under a lot of external pressure, because it was right around the time that California had deregulated utilities, but it was a very staid organization, and I'm pretty sure you don't think staid and Eugene in the same sentence. So it was a really weird fit for me, but I did meet some really cool people there, and I actually followed a really cool person there. So in light of that, that was okay. But yeah, I was poorly placed in the job.
Well, and I had the opposite experience where I was an individual contributor for most of my career, first starting out in sales and then in new business, because an advertising agency, when you run new business, I would have assistants. I'd have maybe one or two people working for me. But as far as like managing a team, I didn't do that until much later. But what I did is I would manage pitches, right? So for those of you who haven't worked in an ad agency before, if you're doing a big national pitch, particularly this was like, 10, 15 years ago in my heyday of doing this, it was like running a Broadway show. Right? You had to get people from different backgrounds, different walks of life. There would be people from the C-suite. There would be kind of like, very junior project managers or creatives. And they had to do all of this speculative work. You work for free. Give us your creative ideas and we'll see if we want to hire you to do our tens of millions of dollars of advertising and media. And so you'd have a very specific time frame, usually about, like 6 to 12 weeks, in which to churn out all of these deliverables. And so I learned in that experience how to do the lowly jobs of like making sure everybody is fed, making sure that, the basic project management up to the highest kind of strategic, and then just like, C-suite wrangling, right? Like we were at one point, we were pitching I was working at an agency that was pitching a big box retail store. And we all converged in one city to do this pitch. And the C-suite folks, and this was a global agency. So these guys, they were all guys. Some of them weren't even from the United States. And the ones who in the United States didn't shop at this particular retailer. And I was like, you can't go pitch this particular company if you have never been in one of their stores. And so I huddled them all together and herded them through. These are men who hadn't shopped for a gallon of milk for many, many years, right?
Yeah, right.
And it actually ended up being fun. The chief creative officer, who's from South Africa, was delightful and curious and engaged, and was like excited, like, wow, people really, they shop here. This is where they get their stuff. But it was this really interesting skill set that I accidentally developed of how to work with all these groups, keep everybody on task, and basically manage all of those egos, right? So by the time I actually was a manager with a team, I had lots of experience doing this, and it was a relief to me to have a team that I managed consistently over time, right? Yeah. So I had already, I think I had already started graduate school learning about management when I actually got that sort of leadership job. So I had the flip of what you had.
Also, I mean, personality-wise, I think you probably like people more than I do. so I remember my first major kind of managerial deal was with a bunch of Condé Nast people for a men's fashion magazine in Los Angeles. They were ex-Condé Nast people. And I was constantly in my head rolling my eyes, because I was like, I understand that this is an important part of the job, listening to my associate editor explain to me why she was leaving her boyfriend and moving to a new house, and but I just didn't care. I was mono-focused, like I'm on the spectrum that way. I was really focused on an award-winning magazine and all this static about other stuff, but that was an important part of the job. So I was like, yeah. Oh,
well, and it's interesting because I think when you come into management, what is your analogy of what a manager does, right? So I know for my dad and talking to him about work,
Mhm.
it was like a basketball team because he played sports, right? And so
Right.
he would use, basketball analogies or football analogies because I think that was his framework for work,
Right.
right? For
Right.
me, my framework was being a parent.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
not at all to infantilize people that worked for me, but just
Mm-hmm.
that idea of sort of the give and take and the
Yeah.
recognition that at least with my children, you could offer suggestions, but you weren't necessarily in charge all the time.
Yep.
Right. And that
Yep.
idea of knowing when to sort of be firmer and knowing when to allow somebody to explore. My kids were teenagers by the time I became a manager, and that was always the frame that I used. Did you have a frame of reference?
Yeah, of course. That's why I'm smiling, because my frame of reference, I've been doing music and musical theater for the majority of my life. Like since I think the first time I stepped on stage, I was 5. So my framework is, and I've been doing band stuff since 1980. So as a singer, my attitude is really super well suited to an IC, into individual contributor. Because I don't know what you guys are doing back there, but as a singer, yeah, somebody made a joke: first to start talking, last to stop talking, and never around to carry equipment, and that is not the definition of team playing at all. So I've had to make a lot of adjustments, but the thing is, I look at the bellwethers of whether or not I've been successful. What was my attrition rate like when I was leading a team? How many people did I have to fire? Not just people who said, "Screw this, I'm getting another job." I really don't like this job, and those numbers have been blessedly low. So in general, and this is not just I'm still in touch with a lot of people who I had managed before. They seem to have enjoyed the experience despite my obvious shortcomings as a people person.
Well, and I think for me, I mean, the team that I first managed they were very young and they were mostly women.
Right.
And there was a really nice dynamic there. And in fact, many years later, I'm in touch with them. I mean, one of the main reasons I'm on Instagram is just to watch these women with their kids. Now they all have kids and, see what they're doing with their careers. And, I joke about having my own personal old girls network in advertising up and down the West Coast. And so for me, there was a real sense of connection. Like these were young women that I hoped to mentor, and that I really had this hope that their work experience wouldn't be as rife with sexual harassment as mine had been. Right. And so I did have a sort of motivation for it. And I think that's what, back to what this listener had suggested, I think what he was talking about is the idea that particularly at these larger FANG companies, there are a lot of implicit, like kind of managerial rules. And so they're not just not telling you how to fire somebody or some of these sort of like basic training things. They're also not telling you about what it's really like up in that atmosphere, right? And like one of the things that he talked about is that a lot of companies have stack ranking, right? And for those of you that don't know that, what that means is if I came into Eugene and said, okay, you've got 10 people, 2 of them have to be fired. So come up with the bell curve, right? And the top ones are going to get a raise, the middle ones are going to get nothing, and the bottom 2 are going to get laid off, right? So that's in a nutshell kind of what stack ranking is. And it's something that has been done kind of infamously over at Microsoft in the day, and it's still very much part of the culture. And what he was suggesting is that whether or not you have an actual stack ranking system, a lot of places have that anyway, right? And part of the challenge for a new boss may be that they are looking at their team as a standalone entity, right? And maybe they look at their team and they think, wow, these are all really solid performers. And if they're not clued into the larger management dynamics, they may not realize that they still have stack ranking and that they are going to have to cut the bottom 2 people. And the challenge, and my listener cited a particular example, when he came in of really feeling like somebody was a strong performer, saying, you've got a great future here, in words to that effect, and then finding out that he had done something to piss off somebody in higher management who wanted him gone. Right. And one of the dynamics that the listener pointed out that I think is interesting is that a lot of times the people who work for a new boss will get frustrated because the new boss is not making any waves. But what they may not understand is the new boss is doing what he or she can to protect the team, which means I can't make big promises to you. I
Yeah,
can't say that I'm going to give you X, Y, or Z. And so I think that's something for new bosses, is to recognize that the air as an individual contributor might be very different than the
yeah.
thin air of management, particularly at that executive level.
I can't, and also I'm thinking of a situation in which I was being forced to make cuts to my staff, and I dug in and refused. I mean, it was an attempt to mitigate a certain amount of loss, to cook the books fundamentally for the next purchaser, and so they said, okay, well, you won't lay anybody off, we'll lay you off, which is fine. I was not. I just It was a small enough team that we had 6 people on the team, small enough team, and they were all like really compromised. Some had compromised themselves for me. Left his PhD program in ethnomusicology, which maybe wasn't going anywhere anyway, and came out to be my associate editor. Left his entire life in Indiana, came out, wasn't going to get rid of him. Had a 60-year-old creative director, wasn't going to get rid of him, just bought a house. The managing editor whose mother had just died. I mean, there were reasons not to get rid of everybody except for me. So what I found interesting in the aftermath, of course, they got caught when there's due diligence. The company that bought it discovered their chicanery, and they got in big trouble, and it was all clawed back. So it was all for naught anyway, on the part of the people who were trying to force me to make the cuts. But what I found really interesting, and it's like, I kept thinking of Don Rickles, like, you want a cookie? That the 60-year-old designer had just bought a house. I'd asked him for a very small favor later, right? Fully expecting that he was mindful of the sacrifice I had made for him. I asked him to design the cover of my first novel. And he's like, I'm not doing it for free. I said, I didn't say anything about free. I'm willing to pay whatever you're charging. He goes, well, I'm really busy. And I was like, I got it. The wages of heavy is the head that wears the crown. You don't get cookies for this. You don't get cookies for being a nice guy. That's a new boss trick that you will learn over time. That this was maybe 20 years ago. I finally figured out, you don't get cookies for this. It's like being a good dad. Like, your reward is that your kids are not screwed up. So,
Right.
in this
And I
instance,
think, and that's a really good point. And I like that line, you don't get cookies for this, because I have to say that to a lot of, I've said that more than once to clients that I'm doing executive coaching for, who are maybe moving into, they've been managers, but they're maybe now executive managers, CEOs, whatever, there is that sense of like, don't they understand? Right. And I'm like, no one really likes the boss. I mean, you might respect the boss, you might come to like the boss, but they're never going to appreciate what it is that you're doing for them. Right. They're always going to have a sense of, you should have done this or whatever. And, I feel like I've heard people say, this generation is so entitled through like 3 generations now.
Right.
And I think,
exactly.
And it's not millennials,
Gen X,
it's not Gen X, it's not any of those. What it is it's employees are not going to like say thank you to their boss for pretty much anything that is being done.
Right. And, and I sort of understand that if the boss is also the owner and the founder. But a lot of times it reminds me of that great line from Godfather Part 3, the only good line, when Michael Corleone is talking to the priest, and the priest is like, hey, we have people we have to answer to. We have rules. This is Catholic Church. We have very old rules. And so I think about this in connection to being bosses. Like they unless they're like the owner and the founder, and even then they have a board, they're rules. They've got super... Like I have a certain amount of sympathy for even the bad bosses I've had. But, the worst bosses I've had, of course, have had nobody to answer to. And we've covered that on a past show.
Right. Well, and just a couple of practical things. If you are a new boss, one of the things that I suggest, particularly to more senior clients, is if you're getting a new job, right, whether it's a new role in an existing company or moving to a new company, negotiate for some sort of executive coaching or ongoing training when you're coming in the door, right? Which sometimes you can get, sometimes you can't, but ask for that, right? And then I think if you don't have an organization that supports training for people, because I rarely get hired to do even trainings for people who are not at the C-suite level. And I frequently said to clients, like, let me just do a class. Let me get a cohort of some of these mid-level people right? Because the mid-level people are the ones that are really going to make or break you, particularly at larger organizations.
Yes.
And they usually won't do that. So if you can't get that, try to find resources online, right?
Yeah.
And what I would suggest, some people have had good luck with those kind of things like Chief, which is an organization for women, and you have cohorts of networking. It's also very expensive and evidently a little racist. But there's been some real concerns that the women who founded it and the women who are in kind of leadership have not really been mindful of the concerns and the critiques of women of color. Right. And so there's been that's a whole nother thing that you can, I'm sure, Google and find out about. But I think the idea is try to figure out ways in which you can get educated yourself. Right. There's excellent podcasts out there. There's a ton of business books. There's different, things that you can read on Substack, like, for example, the Consigliere papers, which I write. But you really need to take responsibility for learning how to continue to be a better boss. So if you're a new boss, think about those kinds of things. And then do take time to build in feedback loops, right? With your manager, if you can find a mentor who's also in executive leadership, but maybe you aren't that person's direct report, try to have feedback loops with the people who work for you, right? There's a thing called the skip level, which is you have a one-on-one with a person who works for somebody who works for you. Whatever the feedback loop is, try to find people who will give you honest feedback, right? Here's a great example. I was a couple of weeks ago, I was having lunch at a convent with a bunch of nuns. And I walked in and there was an empty table. And so I went and I sat down and took out my lunch, which I had brought with me. And I started getting the side eye from a couple of old nuns. And I had no idea what was happening. And I'm like, there's nothing with what I'm eating. And one of the nuns, who's a friend of mine, came over and she said, that's so-and-so's table. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they said, so-and-so, who's an older nun, always sits in that particular place.
Are these one chair at the table or what's the problem?
6 chairs at the table, but there was a group. And I think the idea was what the point that I'm making is that the nun that came over to me and said, hey, here's a convention culturally that you don't know about, that I am going to let you know as a visitor to this place so that you don't inadvertently fall afoul. Right. And the idea is, and I use lunch on purpose, right? Because there are people who get very attached to something small in a workplace culture, right? Who sits in what chair in the conference room, who uses what thing. And so the idea is trying to find someone who is that cultural guide to you, who can let you know, here are the things that you wouldn't think are going to piss people off, but that are actually going to piss people off. So like now I know I never sit at that table. I sit at another table because somebody came in and told me that.
Okay. I'm hung up on this table thing. So hold on. There were multiple chairs at this table.
Yes.
Were they all filled with people?
Under normal circumstances, there is a tight group who sits at a table together for lunch.
Where were they?
They were coming in. I got there first.
So they would have come and seen you there. There would have been no room for one of them.
Right.
I got you.
And then they didn't want to exclude one of them because they always sit together. Some of them have mobility issues, which and it's more comfortable for them to be at that particular table. Any of these things which I had known, if there'd been
so you moved.
handicap something. I didn't move because nobody else was actually sitting there. They sat at another table. But I've never sat there again. And I think that I don't want to belabor the nuns at lunch story. They're lovely women. But the idea that you can sometimes inadvertently fall afoul of certain cultural tropes. And you need somebody to tell you that.
This is why I mean you're a people person. I had a guy and I'm going, no, it's fine. I'll just sit on the floor. Because I know this whole vow of celibacy thing, you guys are kind of cranky. And that would have been my last day working at the convent, I guess. So.
Although with these friends, they probably would have been like, great, come on back. That's all right. We'll sit down on the floor with you. Let's all break bread together. So I think the idea is just being mindful that there can be different kinds of culture and try to, be intentional about that. So did you have do you have a fire me for us?
Yeah, I do. I mean, sometimes, in the Valley, it's this weird kind of accretion thing that these things lay on top of each other. And I'm probably 100% sure that anybody within the sound of my voice at this point or watching did not participate in the cultural event that I participated in on Saturday, which was UFC 290. UFC stands for the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the only sporting event that I pay attention to with any regularity. Now, they're in a tough place. They're owned by Endeavor, which Endeavor is what William Morris used to be before it started to gobble up the world. Massive agency. Your favorite movie star is probably repped by them. Endeavor has also bought WWE, a company that's had sexual harassment problems with the CEO. I'll get into that. The CEO of the UFC was on New Year's Eve, videotaped slapping his wife and kicking her on the floor. They were both drunk, he says, and he owned up to it in that public apology. Not any major change in how the corporation is run. So insofar as possible, they find themselves in 2023 having lost a lot of their major stars, alienated others. People have left for better paychecks other places and have offended as well. I'm thinking of Conor McGregor, who was recently accused of at the Miami Heat basketball game, sexually assaulting a woman in the bathroom. He has not been fired. But at the fights on Saturday, they have a typical cameraman thing that they do where they go through the audience and they film, oh, it's a professional baseball player, professional hockey player. Oh, look, here's an actor. Here's Anthony Kiedis from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And suddenly the camera switches to the multiply indicted former president of the United States of America, Donald Trump. I was like, okay, all right, Donald Trump is there. Got nothing better to do with his time. Former casino guy. It might make sense that he's there. I'm not a Trump guy, but I can live with this. Somehow, I'm sure the CEO got a hold of the TV folks in the booth in charge of live broadcast and said, give me more Trump time. So now I'm sitting, instead of watching a fight, I'm watching Trump shake the hands and stand with certain fighters and, glad hand his way. He had come from a campaign speech next, since he's now technically running for president. And he's there, and the audience is cheering. And somebody gave me a hard time for what I'm about to say. They said, hey, if it was Biden and people, it was just respect for the office. I go, that's not respect for the office. That's something else. There's people signing on to an agenda that he represents, which is fine. But if you're trying to run a worldwide global organization, politicizing it when you're paying your employees 13%, where every other sports is 50%, it's a bad look. It's a bad look. I feel like it's bread and circuses. What's happening to corporations where there's no sanction for this? I stopped shopping at Whole Foods when the guy said that this former CEO said that Obama was a fascist. It's like, you want to politicize it? You pay the price for politicizing it. Now they've sold, and now they're no longer owned by the same guy. So now I can go back to Whole Foods when I've got a few extra $1,000 to buy an apple with. But yeah, Dana White is. I think that this is, the fish rots from the head. I think Rahm Emanuel's brother, should tighten the reins, and I think it's bad business, especially with 13%. Let me give you an example of what that means. One of the Hall of Fame guys who fought was talking about his career earnings, $10 million. That's pretty good from a poor country boy from Oklahoma, he says. The finance guy, who at Bloody Elbow did a breakdown, said the fight that he made the most at, which is $1.3 million, the UFC made $93 million, not gross, net. So I'm glad you're advancing the fortunes of a guy who will sign on to whatever you want to do in the future, but the naked face of greed, and it just rubs me the wrong way as a fan. It makes it hard for me to enjoy.
Well, and I'm still hung up on the idea that, like, showing Trump shows respect for the office. If Trump had ever showed respect for the office, if Trump had showed respect for democracy in any way, right? But anyway, I want to end with this quote. I'm talking about kind of arrogance and the tech bro mindset. It was in the New York Times last week. Paul Krugman was writing about tech leaders who say there is actually recession. What they're saying is that the government is hiding it. And he calls them recession truthers, and prominent among them is Elon Musk. So here's what he writes. Technology billionaires are especially susceptible to the belief that they're uniquely brilliant, able to instantly master any subject, from COVID to the war in Ukraine. They could afford to hire experts to brief them on world affairs, but that would only work if they were willing to listen when the experts told them things they didn't want to hear. So what happens instead all too often is that they go down the rabbit hole. Their belief in their own genius makes them highly gullible, easy marks for grifters claiming that the experts are all wrong. And I think that's what is kind of the through line here, whether it's Dana White, the UFC, the potential for bad new bosses or just bad bosses in general. It's that contempt prior to investigation. I know everything, that kind of arrogance and hubris that makes it so that they can't hear anything that is going to make them change their perspective or see something different.
And it also exerts a chilling effect through the organization because nobody's hiding how business works there.
Right.
So if you don't like it, you take it on the arches. That's your only option. There's no improving it, no changing it. And that's, we're happier the greater agency we have. That's a situation which you pretty much have zero agency. So
yeah. All right. Well, that's about all we've got time for. We'd love to hear from you. WTF@badbossbrief.com. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Bad Boss Brief with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's the number 3, on Instagram. Send us your questions or comments to WTF@badbossbrief.com. And be sure to join us right here on your favorite podcast platform for more insights every other week. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.